Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles, and on this video we're talking about why Sabu is so important. And the reason I'm doing this is as we go on and the further we get away from the heyday of ECW and the highlights of Sabu's career, the more the man doesn't get his flowers, doesn't get his respect, doesn't get his due for how important he was to professional wrestling, how innovative he was for professional wrestling, and how much he helped shape the landscape of pro wrestling. The first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to start this with two quotes. First, coming from Paul Heyman, and I quote, "To this day, the innovator is the master of his craft. When Sabu was at his best, no one could touch him." That's coming from Paul Heyman. So think of all the people that Heyman has seen, has worked with. The Undertakers, the Steve Austins, the Brock Lesnars, the Roman Reigns, and this is the praise he puts on Sabu. The second quote comes from the wrestler I consider to be the greatest wrestler of all time, Terry Funk. And I believe this came from his book, or it came from an article that he wrote about Sabu. Pretty sure it's from his book, though. It's been a number of years since I read his book, but I'll give you the quote. "Over the years, Sabu's contribution to wrestling have been forgotten by a lot of people, it seems, and his historical impact is undervalued by many so-called wrestling experts." Basically saying exactly why I'm making this video, talking about Sabu being undervalued. And part of that, I think, is because of ECW. And don't get me wrong, I love ECW. You're probably going to be hard-pressed to find someone that's a bigger ECW fan than me. But the reach of ECW, the thought of ECW, looms more in the wrestling world than the actual people that watched. While Sabu was doing all his great work in the company, they were the third most viewed company in America. And it wasn't close to either the second or the first. You never seen anything where ECW threatened to have ratings as high as Raw or Nitro. It was somewhat of a niche product. It was kind of like, if we compare today, for people that are too young to remember, Impact Wrestling. Impact Wrestling gets a ton of viewers. They're a successful promotion. They've run for a lot of years, but at no point have they ever been a threat to WWE, and now they're not a threat to AEW either. So that's part of the reason why Sabu doesn't get the respect he deserves. I'm going to compare this to music. Everyone talks about Nirvana and how Nirvana changed music, and they absolutely did. However, as great as Nirvana was, and they were great, I love just about everything they put out. They put out some fantastic music that holds up still to this day. Nirvana will tell you, there's no Nirvana if they didn't stand on the backs of bands like the Pixies and Sonic Youth. If you go back and listen to the Pixies, you could hear how Nirvana structured their songs by listening to Pixie songs. If you go back and listen to the Sonic Youth, you could hear some of the inspiration for what Nirvana did in Sonic Youth. To me, in that way, Sabu was the Pixie. Sabu was Sonic Youth. Other people came along and became Nirvana using the template that he created. And we're going to talk about that more in a moment, but I think that's the biggest reason why he's not considered the great innovator that he actually is. Because some of the people that came after him and used his style went a lot further than he did. Back to his actual influence, however, it can't be stated enough how important Sabu was to both ECW in America and FMW in Japan. When people would get tapes of ECW or FMW and they would look through the highlights, they would see this guy, and this was back in the tape trading era, that was absolutely unhinged. There are no two Sabu matches that are exactly the same. Does he use some of the same moves? Yes, of course, all wrestlers do. But it was almost like Sabu didn't know what he was going to do. Sometimes, even in the beginning of the move, it felt like he didn't know how the move was going to end up. I've seen him say in his own interviews that sometimes he would botch a move on purpose just to give that aura of unpredictability that he didn't know what was going on, that he had no control over what he was doing. The reckless style and the aerial assault that he employed were revolutionary for the time. As much as people like Dynamite Kid and Tiger Mask changed the way wrestlers wrestle, guys like Sabu and one of his contemporaries, Hayabusa, evolved that and changed even more. There are moves that Sabu innovated that nobody gives him credit for. There are moves that Sabu did one time in front of 50 people that sparked 5 of those people to become pro wrestlers. If you look at his real-time impact while he was in the game, I just mentioned Hayabusa, him and Hayabusa seemed to push each other to higher and higher heights to top what the other one was doing. Yet in other people, like Cactus Jack, aka Mick Foley, who I've seen several times say he was threatened by Sabu because for the longest time, Cactus Jack was considered the most dangerous wrestler in the world, and here comes Sabu doing things that Cactus Jack would never do. You look at one of the other people that I said for a quote from earlier, Terry Funk. Look at the style that Terry Funk wrestled before he came to ECW, before he had matches with Sabu, and look at him after. Terry Funk was already a legend. He adopted so much of what Sabu did into his game, and yes, Terry wasn't doing triple jump moonsaults or Arabian presses. Terry changed it, but you could see the influence of Sabu on Terry Funk. For someone as revered as Terry Funk to take that shows you how important Sabu was in itself. Probably the guy he had the biggest direct influence on was one of his best friends and a guy that he came up with in wrestling, sometimes rival, sometimes tag team partner, Rob Van Dam. You look at Van Dam and Sabu, and the difference between the two is Van Dam's just a little bit more polished version of what Sabu was doing. Kind of like what I said with the Pixies and Nirvana. In this case, Van Dam would be Nirvana, who took what Sabu did, cleaned it up, made it more palatable, and became a huge star. A multiple-time world champion in different companies. Without the push and the rivalry, both as friends and as competitors, does Rob Van Dam do some of the things that Rob Van Dam did. Then you take them as a tag team, and I think this is where some of Sabu's biggest influence has continued to this day. I have long said that the Hardy Boys, Matt and Jeff, took a lot of inspiration from Sabu and Rob Van Dam. There were times that I would watch a Sabu and Rob Van Dam tag team match on ECW and then watch the next time the Hardy Boys were on television, and a move that was done in that Van Dam and Sabu match would somehow appear in a Hardy Boys match. And I'm not saying anything bad. It's something that's done all through wrestling. How many wrestlers took the Canadian Destroyer from Petey Williams, or the Diamond Cutter, aka the RKO, which isn't even originally a Diamond Dallas Page thing. It originally came from Johnny Ace. How many wrestlers have taken that influence? How many wrestlers have taken influence from Mysterio? What I am saying is the direct influence, the direct kind of pushing the bar in a different way led us to the Hardy Boys style of wrestling. Again, much like the Nirvana Pixies comparison from earlier, the Hardy Boys took what Van Dam and Sabu did, changed it, added their own little bit of flavor to it, and became widely considered one of the great tag teams of all time. Now let's extrapolate that to today and current times. If you look at the landscape of wrestling, there are no bigger influences on the current landscape of wrestling than Matt and Jeff Hardy, especially in the tag team. With that being said, either directly or indirectly, Sabu has influenced the whole generation of wrestling, whether it be a direct influence like guys like the Briscoe brothers, who have came out and said that Sabu was one of their influences, that they grew up watching ECW and wanting to be like Sabu. And if you watch the early Briscoe brothers matches, they're a lot more high flying. They adopted their style to fit themselves more. You look at other tag teams like the Motor City Machine Guns and how much you could see the influence from two guys from Michigan following in the footsteps of two other guys from Michigan. You see teams like the Young Bucks right now, one of the top tag teams of the last decade, arguably one of the great tag teams of all time. Whether you love or hate them, the Young Bucks and their style is directly going back to the Sabu playbook. And that's just his influence on tag team. Let's talk about his current influence on singles wrestling. If you watch a guy like Darby Allin, you could see the dangerousness of Sabu coming through in Darby Allin. Whether it be the insane coffin drop from off a stage, or just the reckless abandon that he puts into his matches, the absolute disregard to his own safety, and being willing to throw himself like a weapon, much like Sabu did. You look at somebody else like Jon Moxley, and you look at the violence and the other aspects of Sabu's wrestling, other than the high-flying stuff which we've covered for most of this video. A lot of people tend to look at Sabu and either look at him as one or the other. He's both sides of the coin. He's just as influential in the hardcore style, deathmatch style of wrestling. Take a look at what Moxley does and his willingness to shred his body through barbed wire and glass, and you look directly back to Sabu and the stuff he did and the legend that he created, and really the whole company of ECW did. Then you look at somebody that's not necessarily as easy to see the influence as a Seth Rollins or a Will Ospreay. I've read articles myself where Seth Rollins says that Sabu's one of his biggest influences, that he's one of the reasons why he got into wrestling. You look at him, you look at somebody like Will Ospreay, who's an absolute innovator, and you look at the way that Will Ospreay creates and harkens back to what Sabu did. His willingness to evolve, his willingness to try different things. Seth Rollins, same thing. His willingness to evolve, his willingness to be different, his willingness to wrestle a style that's probably not the best on your body. I mean, just look at Sabu. He's not in the greatest health, but it absolutely makes these two guys two of the top wrestlers in the world right now. And for someone like me, someone that's watched countless hours of wrestling and could see influences from one wrestler to another, you could see little things that even the wrestlers may not know came from Sabu, because Sabu has influenced so many people that someone like, let's say, a young guy like a Nick Wayne may pick up something that Sabu did, but he didn't pick it up from Sabu. He picked it up from Seth Rollins, who picked it up from Sabu. Or he picked it up from the Young Bucks, who picked it up from the Hardy Boys, who picked it up from Sabu. So the further we go along, the more his influence just grows and grows. To me, I consider him one of the most important wrestlers of the 1990s. And without Sabu, without ECW, we do not have the wrestling that we have now. Whether you like it, whether you hate it, Sabu himself, ECW as a company, changed the landscape. The ripples and reverberations from what Sabu did are going to go on long after I'm dead, long after Sabu's dead. Generations from now, if they're still doing professional wrestling, you're going to see stuff that Sabu innovated still 50 years from now, 70 years from now, 100 years. That's how influential. He's just as influential as Gotch or Hackenschmidt, if you really think about it. And that's basically just what I wanted to get at this video, what I wanted to bring up, what I wanted to mention, basically to give a guy his respect that doesn't seem to be talked about as much as he should. I mean, we hear a lot of people talk about Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, and how they are influences. We hear people talk about the Hardy Boys being influences, John Cena, different wrestlers. We don't hear as much about Sabu. And with this video, hopefully I opened some people's eyes to it. Hopefully some of you that are watching this and may not revere Sabu as much as I do, go back and watch some of his matches, go back and watch some of his career, and really appreciate just how great he was. If one person does that, this video was a success. That being said, let's go ahead and smash that like button, share the video, subscribe if I haven't. And if you see that little button that says join, that's how you become a channel member. It definitely helps the channel out if you decide to do that. If you'd like to see me do more of these somewhat deep dives into a wrestler's career, let me know down here in the comments. If you made it to the end, let's put a Sabu in the comments. With all that being said, my name is George Coles, and you've been watching Heel Heat.